Good morning, afternoon, evening, late at night, everybody. I'm not sure where you're joining from, but from wherever you are, thanks for joining us. My name is Amie Stepanovich. I am the Vice President for U.S. Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum, and we're here to talk about what was it again? Is it extended reality, XR, which encompasses all different types of tech from augmented reality, mixed reality, virtual reality. If you don't know what any of those things are, I have exactly the speaker lineup of people who are going to tell you and why you should care about them. So actually, let me just dive right in and turn to the three people who are going to be answering all the hard-hitting questions on extended reality today, and have you all introduce yourselves. And as an introduction, tell me your favorite immersive game or experience that you've had.
I can go first, if I may. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Berrick. I'm a policy counsel here at the Future of Privacy Forum, and I work on immersive technology issues, among other things. And my favorite game from a virtual reality experience was Robo Recall, which also happens to have the honor of being the first game I ever played in virtual reality. And essentially, you can matrix your way through hordes of misfunctioning robots. And it kind of taught me the power of extended reality technologies to provide incredibly immersive experiences compared to like typical 2D games. And that's kind of what set me on my path to where I am today.
Hey everyone, my name is Jameson Spivack. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Future of Privacy Forum, and I lead the organization's work on the privacy and data protection risks of immersive technologies. In terms of my favorite immersive experience, so a number of years ago, I was lucky enough to experience an incredibly powerful immersive project called Carne y Arena, which translates to Flesh and Sand, created by the director Alejandro González Iñárritu. And essentially, it simulates the experience of immigrants coming into the U.S. through Mexico. First, the viewer is isolated and placed in a real-world mock holding cell, told to take their shoes off. After waiting for a certain period of time, you're entered into a dark room filled with sand, given a VR headset, and putting it on, you are immersed in a scene in which there's a raid on immigrants at the U.S.-Mexico border, and you're able to walk around and view the scene while it unfolds, and it feels like you're actually there. And this was my first experience with an immersive technology in which I realized the incredible storytelling powers that this technology has and the potential for evoking empathy in a way that's really just not possible in other mediums.
That's interesting. That was actually my first VR experience as well. The exact same thing. And I was working at the time, I was working on the Homeland Security Committee in Congress. So it was especially impactful because I was working on policy around immigration and border security and all of that. And it was really just incredible. I mean, it blew me away. Fantastic. So everyone should have the opportunity to do something like that. Anyway, that's it. I'm Joan O'Hara. I am Vice President of Public Policy with the XR Association. XRA, as we are known, is a relatively new trade association. We're less than 4 years old, and we focus exclusively on policy and advocacy around XR technology, so augmented, mixed, and virtual reality. We're a pretty small team. So I have a partner that I work with who's fantastic. She's the director of public policy, but together we handle all of our government relations and policy work. So it's been a really exciting experience. I've now been with XRI for about 2.5 years just to see the uptick in interest and conversations around this technology and where it's going. So very happy to be here with you. I think my favorite VR experience is going to be kind of boring compared to robots and games and all of that kind of cool stuff. I like sort of the meditation apps. I really, but I mean, to sort of piggyback on what Daniel was saying about being fully immersed in something and what that feels like. I love being able to just transport somewhere else, and if it's a stressful day or there's a lot going on and you can put on your HMD and be sort of relaxing underwater with the manta rays and things like that. It really does. It changes the way that you feel. So experiences like that are something that I really enjoy.
Thank you all for that. I will never forget my own first experience because it was like walking through a series of vignettes. And at one point, they put me on a metal grating platform at the top of like a 30-story building. And what I remember most from this was I'm standing in a conference room and I'm grasping for the railing, which was very present in the virtual world, but of course not present at all in the real world. And I'm like, I can't find it. I'm going to fall off this building. And that really like belief in my head that I could fall off the building at any time showed me the power of what these devices and this technology can do when you get plugged into it.
Yeah.
So we've talked about some experiences of immersive technologies and extended reality. A lot of people have heard in the news about this thing called the metaverse. And FPF recently published an infographic on extended reality. So I'm going to turn to Jameson first. Jameson, you're on notice. Can you tell me a bit about what extended reality is? What are the different technologies that we believe are in extended reality, and how would you classify them? How do they differ from one another? Just walk us through what this space is.
Thanks, Amie. So let me just state up front that what we're talking about today is specifically extended reality, or XR, that we shy away from using the term metaverse. And while others may argue that XR is an integral part of a theoretical metaverse, for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's helpful to focus specifically on XR technologies that exist now. So with that said, XR is an umbrella term that includes virtual reality, or VR, augmented reality, AR, and mixed reality, MR. These technologies exist along a spectrum and refer to technologies that have some level of blending between the physical world and the digital world. At one end of the spectrum is VR, a fully immersive digital environment in which a virtual world is the user's main experience rather than their physical space. So an example would be Meta's Oculus Quest headset, very popular VR headset, most popular in the US, and it allows users to feel at least as close to totally immersed in another environment as possible. At the other end of the spectrum is AR, which provides a view of the physical world with an overlay of digital elements. So people will oftentimes think of Pokemon Go. You're still able to see the physical world, but the application has added a virtual element on top of it. And then in the middle of these is MR, which combines elements of both AR and VR. And it provides a view of the physical world in which digital elements interact with the physical environment and vice versa. So for example, a training program for surgeons or for car mechanics could help workers practice complex tasks before completing them in the real world. So that's kind of an outline of what XR is and the different kinds of technologies that fall under this umbrella.
Thanks for that, Jameson. Why don't we go over, Joan, to you? As you said, you run public policy for XRA. Can you give us a snapshot then of the XR industry right now? What are you seeing, not only in the US, but this is a global space. It's very much happening all over the world. What's going on out there? What are applications of XR technologies?
Yeah, it's been a really exciting year. For better or worse, the Meta announcement, or at the time, the Facebook announcement that they were rebranding as Meta and putting all their eggs in the metaverse basket, captured, I think, public attention and imagination. So people who previously weren't familiar with XR technology, or sort of were, but thought of it strictly as sort of a gaming technology, this made them think differently. So that's been helpful, I think, in terms of my job as an advocate for the industry, to have people sort of excited and curious about it. Prior to that, we would talk an awful lot about applications beyond gaming and social interaction. Things like healthcare, where healthcare was an early adopter of this technology and is using it in everything from assisting surgeons to training nurses and medical students, has fantastic healthcare applications for patients, from stroke rehabilitation to PTSD to pain management. I could go on, but healthcare is a big area where we're seeing a lot of very exciting developments. Also in education, Jameson spoke a little bit about his experience that I shared with the virtual reality immigration scenario. It does help to build empathy. It also creates a very memorable experience, and studies show that learning retention is higher when something is learned in virtual reality as opposed to a two-dimensional video or obviously reading something in a book. But anyway, all of these things are very, very important applications, and we're seeing that grow across any number of sectors. But this idea of a metaverse, I think, like I said, has captured people's imagination because it is more about the next computing platform, and the way that we interact today through the internet will be in 3 dimensions, using whether it's VR or AR or MR, using the technology to do all of the things that we would do online today and more. So all of that is just to say that there's, I think, a growing interest, which is a good thing, and that there are more and more conversations around important things like policy. What will this technology look like? How will it impact our lives, our communities? And asking hard questions and predicting, the best case scenario where we create like a better world, a better community, or the worst case scenario where you have your dystopian visions of, AI running the world and people's brains being, their minds are being read and all of this and everything in between. But it's really important to think about all of that now while we're still developing the technology. So I'm really excited that we're having a conversation like the one we're having today. And then abroad, US, I think we tend to focus a lot on, at least in the last few years, a lot on sort of our cultural viewpoints and our society and internal domestic politics, those kinds of things, and perhaps less so on something like technology development around the world, which is one of the things, through my role at XRA that I'm helping to let lawmakers understand what's going on and why this is impactful. But we're seeing a lot more development and interest abroad. So in Asia, for example, Korea they've been working on this for years. They have sort of a metaverse for their government functions. So people can interact with government agencies in 3D, in virtual reality. They have a plan, I think I wrote it down, called the Seoul Metaverse Initiative or something like that. I had it written down. I'm sorry. Anyway, they are looking to sort of integrate this into their society and the way they do things. I'm sorry, it's here Metaverse Seoul Master Plan. And they have started a Metaverse Academy to help people develop the skills needed to help construct a metaverse and be a part of it. China, they've had the metaverse as part of their 5-year plan for a while, and they have ministries that are dedicated to advancing that technology. In the EU, they have recently, in the last couple of months, launched something called the Global Metaverse Regulation Initiative to really get a head start on thinking about rules and regulations around this space and how it will be governed. The way that they're sort of thinking about it, or the way they framed it, is Europe's plan to thrive in the metaverse, which I think is nice and optimistic. So it's this is coming. This is going to be a part of our communities, and how can we make sure that it benefits people and that communities are able to thrive. So anyway, that's just a snapshot, but there's a lot going on around the world to get this concept of a metaverse sort of up and running. And it's important that in the United States, we're making sure that we're paying attention and then doing our part as well.
Absolutely. We want to make sure that we're neither on the outside nor think that we're the only ones looking at this.
Yep. It's very much become a global conversation of late.
Absolutely. And it needs to be. Technology, as we all know, knows no borders.
Right.
And so it's going to be everywhere. I'm going to turn to Daniel and talk a little bit about our infographic and the research that was done, but I'm going to use this like little break of an opportunity to thank everybody for tuning in again and let you know that we are going to be taking questions, and you can put those in the comments, we'll get those over to Joan and Jameson and Daniel to answer during the latter half of the hour. So get those in early and we'll turn over to those. And it's really cool. We have people joining us all the way from Portugal so far. So this is definitely a transatlantic conversation, at least. I believe probably trying to get trans-Pacific is a little bit much considering the time zone changes right now. So Daniel, I said I was going to turn to you. You did a lot of research to build FPF's infographic. And as we start to dive, I think, a little bit deeper into the XR space during this next part of the conversation and what it means for privacy, why don't you give me some information on the types of data we're talking about? What do XR technologies collect, process, use, transmit to third parties? Tell me what space we're looking at here.
Sure, with pleasure, Amie. So in our infographic, we identified 4 main categories of data that XR technologies collect and process, and potentially, as Amie said, share with other parties. These categories include sensor data, location data, XR device data, and data from apps on a user's device and telemetry data. Starting off with sensor data. This is information about the user's body and the surrounding physical environment, which is gathered by sensors located on the device and/or controllers. Examples of these sensors include outward and inward-facing cameras, inertial measurement units, also called IMUs, which measure the velocity and direction of a device, and microphones too. This data allows the device to accurately place itself in relation within a space, so it's quite important. Another kind of data that we identified is location data. This can tell us about the user's precise or approximate geographic location, and it's very important to certain kinds of shared experiences. Another category of data that we identified is XR device data, and this includes hardware and software information, identifiers, and IP addresses. This information, among other reasons, could potentially be used to track users across applications, as it is in other technological contexts. Finally, we have data from apps on a user's device. This can include information like the amount of time spent in an app and with what content a user engages. One reason a party may want to have access to this information is to determine the cause of a software bug or a crash.
Thanks, Daniel. That was super helpful. I want to push you a little bit further. How does this compare to data collected from other consumer technologies that people are going to be familiar with? So think like the smartphone or the laptop that people might be viewing our little conversation on. Smart televisions, Internet of Things devices, technology is everywhere nowadays. Are we talking about something different, or is this just an extension?
So short answer, yes and no. There are definitely kinds of data that are collected in the XR context, which have also been collected in other contexts too. So for example, XR device data can have parallels with the amount of kinds of data that are collected from phones and social media for a variety of different purposes. However, at the same time, when it comes to sensor data in particular, the volume and kind of sensor data that you can get from an XR device and that you may process and share with other parties is different both in terms of the volume and the variety of data. And from that, there is this potential to infer kinds of information which may not have been possible in other kinds of technological contexts.
Thanks for that. Maybe going back to Joan then for a moment. You've talked about the XR space a little broadly. If we can dig in, who are the various actors within the XR ecosystem, many of which Daniel has referred to, and what role do they have to play in ensuring that users have a good experience when they use these technologies? And before I actually turn the mic over to you, our team had the infographic up just a second ago, and I'm going to ask folks, is there a vignette in that infographic, if it's the person walking down the street or the banana playing ping pong, that particularly resonates with you? You can put it in the comments or the chat and just tell us what you think about the different images that we were trying to use to convey. Joan, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we like to think of it as sort of a big tent opportunity. So, I mean, what you would typically think of as participants or stakeholders in this space would be hardware manufacturers, that make the glasses or make the headsets. Your big tech companies, obviously, like Meta, Google, Microsoft, Sony, others. And developers, of course, people that do the coding and make the games and the creative minds behind all of that. I think those are sort of the at the top of the list when you're thinking of stakeholders. But it's also really important to involve folks like yourself, people who are working in the realm of, consumer rights, best interest of individuals using the technology. So your civil society groups, and at XRA we try and engage with civil society often. They're an important part of the conversation. Another stakeholder really is government. Lawmakers are going to be responsible for regulation or legislation, and the administration responsible potentially for rulemaking in this space. So they have to be informed. They have to understand not only what the technology is and how it can be applied, but to some extent how it works. Because, right now we have, a mantra, I think, for the whole industry is privacy by design. So privacy is baked in right from the get-go. It's not an afterthought. But part of that has technical requirements, and there are engineering breakthroughs that haven't yet happened that will impact, for example, if a headset is going to be small and light and not cumbersome, the computing power will have to be much, much smaller, or the devices will have to be much smaller in order to accommodate that. And that's a real engineering challenge. And that's another important stakeholder, scientists and engineers who are working on making this technology better and better and better. So there are a lot of people who are going to play an important role here. So it's not just the obvious ones of the big tech companies and the designers and developers, but policymakers and think tanks and civil society advocates. All of us, I think, have a role to play to make sure that this is a technology that is a benefit to society and not something that goes horribly wrong.
As somebody who reads way too much science fiction, I have way too many examples in my head of it going horribly wrong.
Right.
But we do have an opportunity. Like, this is new, it's early. This is a moment, and I want to get back to one of the issues you talked about regulators and policymakers paying attention. But before that, maybe to open it up to whoever wants to answer this, I'm going to ping once more for questions. Inevitably, during these conversations, like right at the last 5 minutes, we get like 20 questions of people who are like, oh, I have something to ask. And we can never get to all of them. And that's such a shame. If people do have questions, get them in early, get them in now, so we can make sure we have a lot of time to dig into what everybody wants to talk about. So for all of you, why don't we talk about what are the privacy risks within this space? Threats to privacy and naming maybe bystanders in particular here. What are the data protection risks that these technologies create, and how does it differ? Daniel talked a little bit about how the technology itself differs from normal everyday technology today. How do the risks maybe differ from what we've seen before. Does anybody want to jump in on that?
I can go ahead since I brought up, the difference between current technologies that are in wide circulation and XR. So one of the things I mentioned is that XR is known to produce a wide variety and high volume of data, and this can pose privacy and data protection risks from two different angles. One, as I was saying before, this can give opportunities for a variety of actors to infer sensitive information about individuals, which may have been more difficult or impossible to do in other technological contexts. One of the examples that we've cited to both in connection with our work on this infographic and our earlier AR/VR report published last year was being able to infer sexual orientation, at least under lab conditions, when it has been studied, along with other kinds of sensitive insights. Another kind of privacy and data protection risk that arises as a result of the high volume and variety of data points is digital fingerprinting, what essentially means that it's much harder to remain anonymous in virtual environments owing to the quantity of data that we're generating in those environments. And this can have privacy adjacent implications in terms of the speech that people engage with, in terms of if people feel like they're going to suffer repercussions as a result of engaging in certain behavior because they'll be identified and tied with that behavior, they won't engage in that sort of behavior to begin with. Finally, one other risk that we flagged, and Amie, you mentioned this, relates to bystander privacy issues. One of the issues that XR poses for bystanders is, even though data may be collected and processed about bystanders, they may not have notice of the fact that that collection and processing is taking place, let alone understand for what purposes that collection and processing is taking place and to whom that data is shared. And so that can create a lot of issues from a notice and choice angle, which a lot of practitioners think of privacy as kind of revolving around. So those are some of the risks. Oh, I see we've got a question.
Joan or Jameson, do you want to add to that list at all?
Yeah, just I second everything that Daniel said. I thought that was a very good overview. But yeah, I mean, none of this data is really new. We have facial recognition technology. We have Fitbits that can take our pulse and our sense if we're sweating, what our skin is like, voice recognition technology, etc. But it's the aggregate. When you put all of that information together, a profile you're able to create, or what you're able to infer about someone's preferences or behavior patterns, or the way they think about things, that's different. So, and we'll get more into this, I'm sure, in this conversation, but I think transparency around that is really important, that people are aware of the potential risks to privacy, and that the industry and the people developing the technology and putting out these products work with their users to make sure that users have agency and have control over the data and how it's used, at least to some extent. This information is needed, not all of this, but some information, some biometric and sensitive information is needed in order for the technology to actually work. If you have a headset on and you don't have cameras, or you don't have the technology in the headset knowing where your head is shifting, what you're looking at, the experience wouldn't be realistic at all. So, some of the biometric information is necessary, but bringing the user into that conversation and having them understand why it's collected, how it's used, I think is going to be imperative.
Absolutely. And Joan, you talked about how privacy by design kind of is the mantra of the industry. Jameson, I know you've been in particular thinking about this a little bit lately. Here we've laid out some of the risks. Are there approaches that the developers of the technology have been taking to mitigate some of those risks, given what Joan just said, is that some of this information absolutely needs to be collected in order for the technology to function properly?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the technical strategies that organizations that collect or use XR data have been using are on-device processing and storage, so processing and storing data on a user's device as opposed to remotely on a processor server to ensure the data remains in the user's hands and is not necessarily accessible to first or third parties. Data minimization, so only collecting data that is necessary for core functioning of a particular application or device. Privacy enhancing technologies, so building privacy preserving measures into the technology, so certain forms of cryptography and end-to-end encryption, certain differential privacy tools, edge computing, synthetic data sets, things like that, to build privacy protections into the technology itself. Some other things that companies or organizations can do is have third-party developer policies. So for entities that are developing platforms or devices, to create guidelines for the third-party developers who are developing these apps, and then more strictly monitor and enforce compliance with the platform's guidance about what data can be collected, how it can be used, who it can be shared with, and who it can't be shared with. And so these are some of the technical solutions that organizations are doing in regards to actual users. And then thinking about bystanders is a little bit different. And that's actually a really interesting question, because if you take a step back and look at how this theme of an individual is using a cutting edge piece of technology in public to potentially collect data, or they might inadvertently collect data about other people, this theme really goes back to some of the earliest articulated conceptions of privacy rights in the US. So when Brandeis and Warren wrote The Right to Privacy in the late 1800s, it was actually in response to the recent advent of instant photography and audio recordings, which was leading to a booming tabloid industry. And so existing laws at the time about slander and libel and copyright and property, they weren't really adequate to cover the harms that they identified. So this led to their articulation of a right to privacy, which then eventually led to privacy torts. And we saw sort of a similar manifestation of this concern with the rise of cell phone photos and videos, and then norms of behavior evolved around that. And then with XR devices, the question is, does this represent an escalation in technical capabilities such that the risks are greater than they are with, for example, a cell phone? And as Joan touched on before, maybe the data collected is the same, but it's kind of the aggregation of this data. And so there are a number of technical strategies that organizations are coming up with to try to deal with the problem of how to notify bystanders that a person is in their vicinity using an XR device. So external lighting to indicate when the device is using external facing cameras. Of course, this is not necessarily going to be intuitive to bystanders what the light means. And even if they do understand it, they might not have a way to exercise right to data access or deletion, et cetera. But it is a first step in notifying people. And then another thing that organizations are doing, or that device manufacturers are doing, is automatically blurring the faces of people who are captured in raw images from device data. So those are some of the things that developers are doing, both for users of XR devices as well as bystanders.
I feel like in a privacy conversation, when we talk about Warren and Brandeis, somebody has to yell bingo in the background. It's like, oh, we finally hit the line. Joan or Daniel, do you have anything to add to Jameson's really, really good summary there?
I think, Jameson alluded to this certainly, but, the expectation of privacy, that's the big question. So, what constitutes a public space versus a private space, and what are our expectations around that? Given the ubiquity of cell phones, I think, with everyone being an instant, photojournalist or something with just using their phone and can post pictures or information instantly, it does change the expectation to some extent. So social norms, I think, will be a part of this conversation. From a personal standpoint, I don't want to see the expectation of privacy eroded just because we have the ability to capture information or images and share them instantly across the world. I think, we have to maintain that, individuals need a sense of privacy. But what that's going to look like, especially in public spaces and with respect to bystanders, I think is a tricky question, but an interesting one. And it's good that we're grappling with these issues now before everybody's walking around with, a pair of AR glasses, which we very well may be in the next 5 to 10 years.
One thing I'll add to Jameson and Joan's really wonderful points is going off of what Jameson was saying about how certain devices may have lights to indicate when they're recording so that bystanders are put on notice that data may be collected about them. That kind of thing, as Jameson pointed out, has its shortcomings. And that underscores a larger point, which is that you may need several different layered technical approaches in order to achieve the desired privacy or data protection effect. One particular approach may be sufficient under one law, but not under another. And so I think companies and the public at large need to be taking account of that fact when we're thinking about how should these systems be designed with privacy and data protection in mind.
Well, Daniel, I feel like you are purposefully creating a perfect segue into my next question. I had said when Joan mentioned it earlier that we would get back to lawmakers and policymakers and what is happening. You mentioned what is going on with different laws. Why don't we talk about then, are people who are setting the rules around uses of this technology, are they taking it seriously? Do the privacy laws that have either already been passed or that we're debating or seeing introduced today, do those cover all these differences that we've talked and been discussing are brought up with XR technologies? And do you see kind of the genuine inquiry that you'd really want to see from law and policymakers when discussing something that has so much potential and so much difference?
I can say a few things here. So to answer your first question about whether there's been interest from governments about kind of the privacy and data protection risks that these technologies pose, the answer is definitely yes. There are data protection authorities in the European Union. I think the Spanish and the French CNIL have both issued documents which talk
Daniel,
about...
can you say what you mean when you say CNIL for folks who might not know what
yes,
that acronym means?
No, perfectly fine. I probably can't unpack the acronym CNIL, but I can tell you it is what's used to refer to the French Data Protection Authority. CNIL is, it's a French acronym. They've issued documents which talk about the interaction between like GDPR, for example, and what they refer to and understand as the metaverse. So there definitely is an understanding that the laws that are currently on the books are going to have some kind of interaction and effect on these technologies. In terms of how they interact though, so for purposes of this infographic, one of the interaction points that we looked at is whether certain kinds of body-based data that XR devices may collect, process, and share with other parties, for example, gaze-related data and other kind of body movement data, would fit within current legal conceptions of this term that you see called biometrics. And so one of the key aspects of how biometrics are defined in many different jurisdictions is that to qualify for legal coverage or to be afforded extra legal protections and obligations to apply, that data needs to be used for an identification purpose. But as we've been talking about over the course of this call, many use cases don't involve this data being used for an identification purpose. And as such, it's possible, therefore, that this data will fall outside of the law's scope. However, it's important to note that even if this data isn't necessarily being used for an identification purpose, under the GDPR, it still could qualify as sensitive category data if that body-based data qualified, for example, as information about sexual orientation, which is considered to be a sensitive data category. But all this is to say that there is uncertainty about how, in some instances, the law interacts with these new data flows.
If I can add on to that, so I think broadly speaking, while consent is still an important part of privacy frameworks, and the frameworks that Daniel mentioned, whether they cover the data collected and used in XR or not, are largely based on notice and consent, notice and choice, increasingly is not sufficient by itself to cover the risks from technologies and from ecosystems characterized by massive collection of personal data, highly advanced data processing and algorithmic systems, and complex data sharing webs. So regulations that rely exclusively or even heavily on notice and choice or user controls might fall short for a few reasons. One, consent fatigue. It's been well studied that users get consent fatigue and end up just agreeing to all the terms of service without really reading them. And even if they did read them, they might understand them. Particularly in VR headsets or XR devices, it's difficult operationally to set up privacy notices and provide opportunities for user controls to control data flows because the data flows are so complex. And the user controls might be hidden in different menu screens, or there are device level controls and app level controls, and there's so many different types of data that it's really kind of impossible to understand what's going on. Two, data is often relational, so data about one person can implicate another person, and so individual level controls might not necessarily account for these scenarios. And then three, privacy is contextual, so users that agree to give up personal data in one context or for one particular purpose might not understand how that data is being used in another context for a different purpose in combination with other data. So this is true outside of XR ecosystems as well, obviously. But the nature of the data collected, and as Joan talked about before, the aggregation of the data and some of the processing activities, it kind of intensifies this. So I think beyond just consent, some of the things that I mentioned before are also important to include, whether that's on-device processing, data minimization, purpose limitation, instituting privacy-enhancing technologies. I think that these are all really important for regulatory frameworks beyond just consent.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my co-panelists have said so far. But I would also add that we don't necessarily want to rely completely on government to make sure that this relationship between the user and the provider is working and is healthy. Amie, you asked if they're taking the technology seriously and understand it at the lawmaker level. And as I, sort of mentioned earlier, the U.S. I think is a bit behind where some other countries are in the world in terms of taking this seriously and recognizing its potential to really be transformative. We're getting there, and as I said at the beginning of our chat today, the metaverse has sort of elevated the profile and brought this more into the public discourse, which is a good thing. But I think these questions around privacy and really what's at the core of this is trust are so important that we don't want to rely completely on government to have to sort of set the rules and the parameters, and also to sort of catch up and understand what the nuances here and what would be the balance between protecting consumers and also allowing for continued innovation. So I'm of the opinion that I think industry can take a lead here. There's nothing holding industry back from setting best practices and standards and enforcing them. I know there's always skepticism around self-regulation, but I think that that's certainly a step that we can take now. And XRA, we're a trade association, so we represent a number of companies, from the big tech companies down to independent developers and the whole range in between. So getting input from all of these different entities and thinking what makes sense, how do we ensure that there's trust here, that the user feels safe and comfortable and like they are in control of their experience. It's so important. we have, and you can check it out on XRA's website, but we've developed a set of privacy basics, just basic beliefs for the industry of what that relationship should look like and what the responsibilities are. But empowering the user is so important. And, we spoke about consent. I think one of the main problems with the notice of consent model is that it's typically all or nothing. So it's, not only do you not understand what you're reading or have consent fatigue, but if you say you really were wonky about it and, did a careful analysis of the 15 pages of consent requirements, you might decide, okay, well, I agree with some of this, but maybe not other parts of it. That's not an option. It's either accept this or you can't have this experience. So I think that, there's some potential there in terms of like layers of consent or options along the way. And I know that some of our members are thinking along those lines as well. But I don't know if this is the appropriate moment for this or not. But I did want to say, sort of as part of this conversation, that we are working to try and educate people and help the user to understand at least the basics of how the technology works and why it captures certain information, what role that information plays in the functioning of the device. So along those lines, we also created an infographic. It's the battle of the infographics. And it was, and there it is. It's intended to be, very user friendly. We created almost a comic book here of vignettes of a character we created called Kayla. And Kayla goes through her day using augmented and virtual and mixed reality in various contexts, and how it plays a role in helping her to do things, engage with her friends, exercise. She's a medical student, so how it's used in the classroom. But also what information, what data is being collected and how it's being used by the device to facilitate the experience. So that's another thing you can check out on XRA's website. But all of this is to say, it's really important that that consumers understand what this technology is all about, and at least the basics of how it works and why it needs the data that it does.
I mean, when can you have too many infographics, really? Like, throw them all. We'll take all the infographics.
When I saw yours, I was like kicking myself that I didn't have a banana playing ping pong.
Wasn't that brilliant?
I love that, yes.
You too, with extended reality, you too can be the ping pong playing banana. So we do have some questions from the folks tuning in. And I'm going to start right at the top, where we have a question about the fact that XR really has a higher, that refers to a walled garden before engaging with the technology. And if that actually changes conversations around providers versus traditional tech. And so we've talked somewhat about, first of all, the differences in data between extended reality devices versus traditional devices, differences in risks. Now we're being asked if the walled garden piece of XR changes any part of this conversation. Any thoughts from our panelists? You're all doing.
I'm not sure I perfectly understand the question. That's just me.
So if I were to interpret, I think this is, XR, you have to have the technology itself, which is expensive. You have to understand the technology, which can take time and energy. You then have to purchase the applications, many of which are also quite expensive. Think along the lines of video games that you would buy in the store. And so there's a lot of hoops to jump through, things you have to do before you can even start to engage, as opposed to a smartphone, which has discounts before you purchase the device. A lot of the apps are free. People today, maybe not 10 years ago, but today mostly understand how to use a smartphone. It's a different level of engagement and investment. Yeah.
So it's accessing the technology and getting into the market. There are more obstacles, I guess. Well, I think like with most technologies, the prices will come down, and they have. I mean, the Oculus headset, which used to be the Quest, is now I think like $399 or something, but it's come down pretty significantly. So I think as the technology becomes more ubiquitous and we're able to make more of those engineering breakthroughs, the devices will become less expensive. But how we're going to structure this in terms of walled gardens, in the sense of if you're using an Apple iPhone and you can only use certain apps on that device versus an Android or something, those types of questions, that's a conversation that's happening right now among players in the industry. To what extent will these devices and these platforms be interoperable? Will we have one metaverse as we have one internet, or will we have multiple metaverses that you have to, there are barriers to entry for each of them? And literally we're having those conversations right now to see what's going to be the most positive future to benefit the most people. But those are important questions to ask.
So we have another question, which goes into the Brussels effect. Can I get a thumbs up from our panelists? Does somebody want to explain the Brussels effect? You want to go, Dan? Nobody's here to listen to me talk, so I'm going to let you all do it.
That was a slight hesitation there, so please correct me if I'm wrong. So my understanding of the Brussels effect is the fact that the European Union has been the first mover with a variety of kinds of legislation in certain topical areas, for our purposes, data protection with the GDPR, has had an influence on other similar legal regimes that focus on the same topic outside of the European Union. So that's kind of my understanding of the Brussels effect. Proceeding with the question at hand, I think companies are definitely cognizant of the fact that they need to incorporate certain features into their products to ensure that they are compliant, and at least are kind of adhering to certain principles which are embodied in the GDPR with respect to providing notice and control over certain kinds of data flows. And with the light example that Jameson was talking about providing notice to bystanders, I think at least at a very elemental level, that kind of shows an acknowledgement of certain principles that are embodied in those laws. That's what I'll say about that.
Joan might be better equipped to speak about this, but I think there's also the question of what the market is like and whether the market in the US is different than the market in the EU, for example. So I know that ByteDance's Pico headset, they're not selling it in the US, they're selling it in Europe and in Asia. And I know in the US, the Oculus Quest is by far the most popular headset. So it's possible that just the market is kind of split anyways, and that might have some impact on this.
I have to say, I had the great pleasure of getting to go to law school with Joan. And so the statement, Joan is probably better to speak to this than I am, is like very familiar in my head because we've got to work on a lot of the same areas. Joan, why don't you go ahead?
It's uncanny how many of the same things we've worked on. And we just discovered we have the same birthday. Not the same year. Amy's a lot older than I am, but yeah, I think absolutely. As I spoke about, I gave you a little bit of a snapshot of what's going on around the world. This is becoming a global conversation very quickly. And if we are going to move into a notion of a metaverse that is really, truly interoperable, global, open, there are going to have to be common rules. We see this even here in the United States with different state laws around privacy. That's difficult enough. But I can tell you that industry is thinking towards the higher standards because, if you have to comply with the law in California, that's setting a higher bar than somewhere else. You obviously want to be compliant with at the highest level. So I do think there will be a Brussels effect. I'm glad to see people having these conversations internationally. And folks from Asia talking to folks from Europe, talking to people from the United States. I just had the pleasure of being in Lisbon, actually, at the Augmented World Expo a couple of weeks ago. And it was great to be able to engage with people from European countries, from the UK, from Asia, talking to developers from Korea, getting their opinions and what they're working on and what they're thinking about in terms of setting standards around privacy, safety, and positive uses for people. So I guess that's a very long-winded answer. Yes, I think there is already a Brussels effect, and that will continue.
So just for a short answer before we move to wrap up, because I think this is a really astute question that we got, quoting Tim Cook, that if the critical thing to any technology, including AR, is putting humanity at the center of it. And the question is, how can we put humanity at the center of XR technologies to better promote and protect individual privacy? Do we have a thought here?
I have a thought. I just spoke, but I'll speak again. I don't want to hog the platform. But I probably sound like a broken record, but I really do believe that that key to the successful development and implementation of all of this is industry and consumers having a relationship of trust and thinking of each other as partners. So industry having the expertise and the resources to be able to develop products that people want, to create experiences that they want that are beneficial for them, whether it's helping to develop empathy around different socioeconomic experiences or different geographic experiences, or if it's providing better healthcare to people in remote locations, or if it's bringing people together to work in a virtual environment, whatever it is, the market's going to sort of indicate what are the demands, and I hope that it will be a relationship where excuse me, industry is responsive to that. On the other side of it, it's the right thing to do to respect people's privacy and have humanity at the center of what we're doing. But it also makes business sense. If people are fearful of this technology, or they think that there's an ulterior motive, or that industry players are not being transparent, or have a hidden agenda or something like that, they're not going to want to use the technology, and it's not going to flourish. So I think it goes both ways, but trust, I think, is at the core of making this a technology that benefits people.
So we're almost, oh, go ahead, Daniel. Do you want to add something?
I'll just add by saying that I think to ensure that humanity is at the center of XR, not just AR, it's very important to keep in mind the scenarios in which this technology is going to be deployed. And furthermore, to be thinking about that at the outset of the design of a technology. You see that in other situations with other technologies, such as artificial intelligence, where that's the encouraged and in many cases now expected best practice, where you're designing technologies with equities in mind from the outset and throughout. So I think developers of apps and devices need to be cognizant of that.
Awesome. So thank you to everybody who tuned in. We are almost at the top of the hour, so there are a lot of questions that we're not going to get to, unfortunately, but all of our speakers are available on different forms of social media and networking websites and in person at different events. So I hope you'll reach out to them. And as we wrap up, I'm going to let you all have the last word. Looking ahead, in a tweet length, or I guess now we say a toot length comment or blurb, can you tell me what you think your number one recommendation is to maybe a new or existing company looking to integrate XR technologies into their product? What would you say to those individuals? And we'll wrap up with your responses.
I'll say, if you want consumers to use XR, you need to earn their trust. If you want to earn consumers' trust, you need to prioritize their dignity when making decisions about how to use their data. And I think it's important to think about users' data rights, but we also need to think about organizations' data responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. I would say exactly the same thing. And of course, privacy by design needs to continue to be a mantra for anyone working in this space.
I appreciate the quote toot. Daniel?
I echo the sage advice of my co-panelists. I think it's very important to design these products with humans in mind to promote trust and also to be cognizant of privacy from the outset when a product's being developed.
Well, thank you all. Thanks to everybody who tuned in, and thanks to the amazing FPF folks behind the scenes who are making all of this work. They are wonderful, really expert folks, without which none of us would be able to be here today. Big kind of virtual round of applause for Joan and Daniel and Jameson. Thanks for coming out today and answering all the hard questions. Thanks for your infographics, your work, your research. And we will make sure everybody who's tuning in has the resources they need to get in touch with you all and view the work that you've done. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me hang out with the FPF crew.
Glad to have you and glad to be here.
That.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.